which is a little bit more than it used to. The fee assistance program does apply, so if you have applied for or intend to apply for the fee assistance program, it knocks $150 off of that fee. So if you think you might qualify, take advantage of that. Registration is open right now for this test through June, and in April, and we don't know exactly the date yet, unless you do, then the rest of the summer dates will be open at that time. The way that the scores are going to roll out is a little unique this year. The first thing that early test takers are going to get is percentile rank ranges, and they're going to be out by the middle of June for both the April and the May test takers. And so I'm going to make a comment in a little bit about how we think that you should approach submitting AMCAS based on when you're taking the test and when you're going to get some of your scores. And then the scores for the July or the June test will be coming out after starting in June. They'll come out on their usual 32-day cycle. The test time is longer. It's 7 hours and 30 minutes. I think you mostly all know that kind of information, which does mean that for people who are taking the test with accommodations, they're testing over 2 days. There are more questions per section. So we went from about 144 questions to a total of 230 on the new test. And that has contributed, obviously, to the additional length of the test, but the reasoning being that they're trying to look for an increased validity of the score in each section. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go. This is a snapshot of what your day will look like. Some of you may have come across this slide on the AAMC.org website. But that's the number of questions, 59, and the number of minutes that you have and the breaks built in. So it's like you said, 6 hours and 15 minutes, but with breaks and the other things, it's a runtime of about 7 hours and a half. There are lots of resources available to help you prepare. There will, of course, be more as coming out also in the future, but the AAMC.org website is your first resource for these materials. You should, if you haven't already, download the Mcat Essentials 2015, which has this information on content scoring, test day essentials, etc. There's also an online interactive tool for what's on the test and sample questions. There's an official guide to the Mcat. They've already released a sample test with, I think, 150 questions. There'll be a full-length practice test coming out in the fall. They have one full-length practice test now. Is that the official? That's the sample. They're not actually calling it officially. Oh, there is? Okay. And then they've also put together these MCAT question packs that you can purchase. And these are maybe some harvested questions from old tests that they felt like were still relevant to use as you prepare for this new test. So if you have old test materials, they don't necessarily say that those are really useful for you, but they've pulled together these question packs, which they think are the useful pieces that still remain from the old test materials. And you
I want to point out that there's no questions on biochemistry, psychology, or sociology in those question packs.
In those question packs.
Because those sort of questions are all new to this exam.
They didn't pull any from the...
There's questions on biochemistry, because biochemistry was a part.
But they did the they did all of that. They did all year long. They did the test section. They didn't pull any from there? Okay. And then there are Khan Academy videos that they frequently recommend, mammalian physiology 440. Biochemistry has been added to the list. Dr. Dixon's going to talk about the difference between 463 and 461 and 2, hopefully. And social sciences, you've got to look at them. So either take a course or an online course, because it's not required by the medical schools, but you need the content for the MCAT. But you need to cover psychology and sociology concepts. And then also statistics is an important course as well. And so we put it on the strongly recommended list. Yes?
I noticed that we don't have psychology 221.
We did until yesterday. But Dr. Curtis had said he couldn't quite understand why we had that on there.
Really?
And since he was our psych and sociology person, I took it off.
And he seemed quite fine.
Yeah. So that was based on his recommendation. So I'm going to leave it there and invite Dr. Cook to take over.
Samantha, can you hear me? Do I need to use a microphone? Okay. For those who don't know me, my name is Todd Cook. I'm a professor of cell biology and molecular genetics. I spent a Saturday taking that sample exam. It's a Saturday I'll never get back again. So I want to share what my experience was, so at least I can say I got something out of it. Okay, so I want to start off by sort of giving you a little bit of history of the revision of the Mcat exam. And the reason why I want to do it is I want to show you that you're actually better prepared for taking this exam than probably students from almost any other school, because we've made an incredible effort among the faculty to have what I call a harmonic convergence between our classes and this exam. But it's a fortunate one. So, in 2003, a group of scientists from the National Academy of Sciences and from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute got together to think about a 21st century curriculum in biological sciences. They came up with a report called Bio 2010, and what they proposed was a major revision in the undergraduate biology curriculum. In particular, what they suggested was that biology was a multidisciplinary subject, so that we had to incorporate a lot more physics, chemistry, and mathematics into our biology courses. And they also pointed out, or actually requested, that we take the standard pre-med courses in physics, chemistry, and mathematics and increase the biological relevance of those courses. Right? And then, if you look at, and you read the fine print, page 9 and a number of other places, they actually point out the Mcat, in this case, is hindering change in the undergraduate biology curriculum and should be re-examined in light of the recommendations in this report. And this is 2009. So, the MCAS folk actually started paying attention to that. So, they published two reports that are called the Foundations for Future Physicians. And this was in collaboration with AAMC is the Association of American Medical Colleges, HHMI is the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Right? And they first published the Scientific Foundations for Future Physicians. They used Bio 2010 as their template for designing this, so the same sorts of perspectives that were in Bio 2010 now appear in this report. And they essentially recommended that the pre-med curriculum emphasize broad competencies. It's the ability to apply basic principles to new situations as opposed to fact memorization in required courses. So this is a shift. When I looked at old Mcat exams, it looked to me like straight memorization. Here, the exams have been restructured. They're very, very interested in your ability to take evidence, to construct a major concept, to support a major concept, and they're really, really interested in your ability to take a major concept and apply it to a situation you haven't seen before. This is going to test an entirely new set of skills. A comparable report was also done by the AAMC and HHMI called Behavioral and Social Foundations for Future Physicians in 2011, and these are essentially the guideposts for constructing the new MCAT exam, the MCAT 2013. What happened simultaneously while the AAMC was going through this revision process is that the faculty in the biological science curriculum and the faculty involved in teaching the basic science courses for the BSCI curriculum and for the pre-med requirements began a dramatic revision of our classes. We were involved in the process of designing the new MCAT, and simultaneously we were redesigning our entire curriculum, the entire pre-med curriculum. So we instituted BSCI 207. Essentially, the second half of that course is organ system biology, which is a major thrust of the new MCAT exam. We changed BSCI 330, the cell physiology class. We upgraded it, made it much more rigorous, added a lot more quantitative analysis to it, aligned it again with what we're going to see in the new MCAT exam. The chemistry faculty dramatically revised General Chem 1 and 2 and Organic Chemistry 1 and 2. The mathematics faculty created an entirely new calculus course. The calculus course that you used to take was a basic calculus for business majors, effectively. They created a new course. They added a fair amount of probability to it, a fair amount of other sorts of quantitative analysis which had not been in the previous calculus course. And the physics course was essentially designed, HHMI basically contracted with the University of Maryland Physics Department to create the new physics classes in the 21st century, biologists and pre-meds. And this is physics 131, 132. This is perfectly aligned with what you're going to see on the exam when I talk about the physics. This is your real advantage on that part of the exam. And so what I'm going to allege is that in terms of your courses, you've been very well prepared for this exam. It doesn't mean you don't have to prep, study hard in your courses, but the courses themselves are aligned in terms of their basic design, asking in a lot of cases the same sorts of higher order reasoning skills that you're expected to be able to do on the exam. Okay, so this is another quote directly from the AAMC. The blueprints for the new exam shift the focus from testing what applicants know to testing how well they use what they know. Right? And in the case you didn't get the meaning of that sentence, the next sentence repeats it. Right? The new exam will ask test takers to apply what they have learned. Right? This is very much, you would argue that's probably not well constructed, right, because they're repeating themselves, but that's the big message we're trying to do. So what we're going to talk about is going to be based on essentially our experiences with the website and with taking this one sample exam. So if you go to the website, we are going to post this. This for everybody. You're recording it? Okay. So, yeah, okay. So you can go onto the website, students applying, AAMC students applying MCAT. You go to Mcat Essentials. They're giving you the basic information, a lot of what Wendy talked about, which are the general procedures for registering, taking, and evaluating the MCAT. There is about 40 or 50 web pages, which you also can link off that top website URL. What's on the MCAT 2015 exam? It's the stuff that we're going to cover. It's going to be exam structure, foundational concepts, content categories, scientific inquiry, and reading skills. Right? The specific information that we're going to give you is really based off a link that can be gotten to the second website called the official MCAT 2015 sample test. This is the only thing that the MCAT has published, essentially, which is a copy or anticipates what that exam is going to look like. It's presumably designed like it. It tells you that you can bring in electronic calculators and other sorts of electronic devices, and you can go through the whole process of preparing yourself for the exam. Okay. So, a take-home message, right? That if you haven't gotten already, this is it. MCAT 2015 is quite different from previous MCAT versions in terms of content, coverage, higher order reasoning skills, and question styles. Right? So, the way to prepare for this, to sort of begin to think about this globally, is, of course, study hard in your pre-med classes. Strive for concept mastery. And we'll give you, I'm sure, a couple of examples from the different disciplines showing you the application of concepts as opposed to just memorizing facts. Instead of cramming the night before to master these exams, especially in biochemistry, make sure you know the basic principles, right? And be able to apply those basic principles. A different sort of study skill, right? You're not studying to memorize facts for the exam. You're actually studying to learn concepts deeply so you can apply them in your situations, right? And that's the second thing. Develop the ability to interpret text, tables, and figures. If you cannot interpret a graph or a table, you're going to be a serious student when you take this exam. Right? So you really have to have basic quantitative abilities. In other words, when you're going through lab classes and you're making graphs, be able to know what those graphs are telling you. Right? Prepare to answer a new style of multiple choice question in the science section. And I'll have an example of that in physics, and I'm sure my colleagues have other examples of this. 1/4 of the exams are discrete multiple choice questions that they're self-contained. 3/4 of them are passage-based multiple choice questions, and we'll talk more about that later. It's a very different sort of exam. I want to share a personal experience. Right? I took biochemistry 40 years ago, so I'm not really great on biochemistry. And I flip to a page, so it's a digital page, right? So the passages are on the right and the questions are on the left. And it was some really obscure biochemical pathway, right? And it was like gluconeogenesis, you know what that is?
Yes.
I have no idea what that is, right?
Not 105.
Right. And so I look at this and I go, oh no, and I completely panic. You know, it's like I'm back taking the GRE. I never took the MCAT, but I'm back taking the GRE, complete panic. I got no idea what it is. Right? And so I sit down, I calm myself down, I say, remember, Todd, you're a professional. and I say, okay, so I read, I don't understand a bloody thing in the passage. Right? And then I look at the questions. And what the questions are asking, right, are me to interpret this passage in terms of Mikhail's Mcat Kinetics. They're asking me to interpret this passage in terms of biochemical thermodynamics. They're asking me to interpret this passage in terms of feedback and enrichment, right? And suddenly I say, well, I know that stuff, right? And so it was very clear to me that if you can go into this exam and you essentially know the basic concepts, when you come into one of these passages and you don't know anything, whatever calms you down, right? Maybe it's, I think I took biochemistry with Professor Dixon, right? Or whatever it is, whatever calms you down, whatever sort of mantra you can have, you just have to relax a little bit, right? And we'll talk about how to read the passage and realize that they're not going to ask you to have memorized that enzymatic pathway or that signal transduction pathway. They're going to ask you to be able to interpret something you haven't seen before. Right? So you need to practice that exam so that you're in a position where you can do by equivalent as I am a professional. Right? Whatever it takes to calm yourself down. Because if you freak out when you think you don't know anything about it, then you've got a problem on this exam. So being able to calm yourself down is, I think, really, really critical. And you can do that when you practice. You practice and you take enough practice exams, you'll be used to seeing passages you've never seen before, but you know the basic concepts that you need to interpret the passage. And we'll give you some examples. Okay, the way the exams is structured, and this is the way I'm going to talk about these 4 sections before we talk about specific portions of the section, is the first thing you'll take is the chemical and physical foundations of biological systems. Right after you have your mid-morning break, you'll take the critical analysis and reasoning skills. Right after lunch, you'll take the biological and biochemical foundation of living systems, and then after mid-afternoon break, you'll take the psychological, social, and behavioral foundations, the biological foundations of behavior. And Dr. Siegel's going to talk about structure. Okay. The chemical and physical foundations of biological systems, this is completely new. If there's any science course where you have to pay attention, right, it's going to be the most important science course that's going to have the greatest effect on your MCAT score. It's Biochemistry 463, right? Because it's 25% of this section and it's 25% of the biology section. It is the single most important biology course, single most important science course you will take. Okay, it appears in both places. Right? In this section, there's a little bit of introductory biology, which is usually basically to sort of frame what the physics and the chemistry they're going to talk about. GemChem, by their designations, is about 30% of this section. Organic chemistry is about 15%. Physics is about 25%. So they're really reducing the amount by their particular way of viewing the exam, reducing the amount of organic chemistry and the amount of physics, and adding biochemistry to this section in comparison to the previous exams. And the study guides you're going to get from AAMC, the previous exams have no biochemistry questions on them because that wasn't included in the previous exam. Okay. And then we'll talk more about the physics and chemistry later on. Okay. So this is all we're going to talk about: critical analysis and reasoning skills. Right? These are standard verbal reasoning tests, right? And so on the sample test, they talked about reduced cholesterol diets, Native American archaeology, Salvador Dali, and artistic creativity, and so forth. They're going to ask you, first of all, if you run into an essay, and if you think you know about what the outcome of this is, or you have definite opinions about this, they're not interested in your opinions, as proud as you are of them, right? They're interested in what the text says, right? So if the text says, for instance, that marijuana is harmful, and you have a personal belief that it ought to be legalized, and you answer questions that way, you're going to get those questions wrong, right? So you can't impose your particular perspective on the verbal reasoning. You have to answer what the text is telling you, right? The other thing is you're going to get two types of questions here. You're going to get specific questions that are going to ask for information about, very specific information. You're going to get also questions that ask for the overall tone of the essay. For example, what would a libertarian feel about this particular passage? So you have to read not only for specificity of content, but you have to have a good idea of the overall tone of the entire passage to answer those general questions. This is going to be different when we get to the scientific passage questions. But for here, read the whole essay thoroughly enough so you can answer not only specific questions, but also these general questions that basically look for your opinion of the entire essay. Okay? And we use a different strategy for the passage of the science questions. Okay, so here's after you've had lunch and your stomach is still a little bit upset, here's what you're going to be facing. So again, in the biology and biochemistry part, you're going to have 25% biochemistry, 65% introductory biology, right? And they talk about this in introductory biology, but when I looked at this exam, the type of reasoning skills I saw that the questions were asking were questions in higher order, higher level biology classes. In particular, genetics, cell biology, and organ system biology, which is what 440 is. But there's a fair amount in 207, and my sense of it is, since I teach 207, the people that did well in 207 should be able to cover that organ system biology. This is only at the level, ostensibly the content is at the level of introductory biology, 105 and 106. It's just the reasoning skills at these higher level of biology classes. Joelle Preston will talk more about that. She may disagree with me too. Okay, the psychological, social, and behavioral foundations. Introductory psych turns out to be really important. Right? Introductory sociology is also really important. There's some really common sense questions. Like I think one that I vaguely remember, or maybe I dreamed about it, was mental health affects the following features: the patient's ability to describe their symptoms, the patient's ability to understand what the doctor's saying, the patient's ability to carry out the doctor's diagnosis, the patient's ability to pay for the medical care. Right? Some of these are really, really simple sorts of common sense questions, which obviously it's medical care because mental health doesn't know any socioeconomic boundaries. So you have some of these are really simple sort of practical questions, and you're likely have accounting, but there'll be other questions such as Weber's concept of the rise of capitalism was associated with, Max Weber's association of the rise of capitalism was associated with the following features, right, of the human condition. It turns out to be the Protestant ethic, work ethic. But you almost have to take a sociology class to learn that, right? So in some ways, if you're trying to self-study this, you've got to pay attention to the fundamental intellectual fittings of sociology and psychology. It's not all practical information. Other than that, you're sort of on your own on that stuff. I'm sorry about that. Because I'm on my own, right? Okay. If you look at this, what's on the MCAT exam, they talk about reasoning skills, the reasoning skills that they value the most. Right? So this is what's continually be on the exam. So first thing is knowledge of fundamental scientific concepts and principles. And so you really need to know major concepts. Right? Second thing is scientific reasoning and problem solving. They want you to be able to construct and put the evidence together to support a principle or an idea, a theory, or a law. And they want you to also be able to take that principle or theory or law and apply it to a new situation. Fundamental scientific reasoning. Evidence, interpretation, application. And they They want you to be able to go all different ways with that. Reasoning about design and execution of research, know what a control is, know how you structure research, know what are reasonable conclusions based on the scientific method. Right? And then they really spend a lot of effort on database and statistical reasoning, being able to interpret patterns in figures and tables and models and a variety of other sorts of things. Basically, what we consider to be quantitative reasoning they value very much. Specifically, the quantitative reasoning that they want is no calculus. Okay, so you're free from that. They want to be able to turn log, semi-log, and log-log plots. They want you to be able to calculate slopes from data. They want you to use significant digits and estimations. You should be able to look at numbers. Remember, there's no calculators here. That means you should be able to look at various sorts of, if you have an equation that has pi in it, stick in a 3, right? Because almost all of it is 3.14. Be able to basically estimate what the values are going to be by using scientific notation. Don't have to do these long calculations. Most of the answers, when they require quantitative answers, are orders of magnitude difference, reflecting that, because you can't use a calculator. Probability, proportion, and so forth, exponentials and logarithms, being able to use scientific notation. It's a particular bugaboo of mine. Is that 25 or 400? Okay. Be really comfortable manipulating those sorts of things. Okay? A surprising number of students have told me this is 400. Okay. Fundamental trigonometry and from physics be able to do really basic, almost qualitative vector addition and the right-hand rule. Okay, that's the overview. We're going to lead into biology. Dr. Joel Preston.
Thanks, Todd. So welcome. Thanks for joining us for this faculty review of the new Mcat. There's going to be some overlap between our different presentations. I think that's a good thing if you hear this material more than once. But in the next few minutes, we're going to be looking at all of this in the context of the biology section of the Mcat. And what I want to focus on in particular is this notion of the scientific foundations for future physicians. And as Todd pointed out, this was coined by the Howard Hughes Medical Institute in their work to develop guidelines for how to ensure that our medical doctors understand that medicine is the application of science to individual patient problems. And that's a real huge shift in emphasis for the AAMC and for the Mcat exam. And so if you think about what this means, what the AAMC and the Mcat exam really want you to do is to be able to think like a scientist. And that's a really interesting phrase. You will actually see that direct phrase in the material about the new Mcat. But this is also something, if you've been a fly on the wall at many faculty meetings, is what University of Maryland science faculty say they want of students. They want you to walk out of here thinking like they do, right? Thinking like experts in science. So the question is, how is the Mcat going to know whether you're going to do that or not, and what your ability is? And the really interesting and unique thing about this exam, at least in the biology section, is that most of the questions are these excerpts that actually to read and interpret and understand actual scientific research literature. So what is that? So what you're going to see, as Todd alluded to, are these passages. Now this is not one of those passages, so just hang on a minute and let me explain this. You're going to see passages they're a little bit like Reader's Digest condensed versions. You don't have to read the whole article, but you will see a brief outline of the introduction, the methods, the actual data, the statistical analyses used, the interpretation, and the conclusions that the authors drew. So it's roughly a one-page condensed version of the entire article. And in fact, at the bottom of that passage, the article will be referenced.
And their recent papers, you know, from the late 1990s up until now. And you're going to hear this probably a lot tonight. This means you are going to see material you have never seen before. You've never seen before. And you're going to read through these passages, and you need to be comfortable doing that. We're going to talk a little bit about how to prepare for doing that. And then you're going to be asked a whole bunch of questions. So, for example, this is actually one of the research papers that was used to construct one of these passages. You may not have any clue that serotonin is actually secreted by platelets. I didn't know that. Platelet derived. You may not know anything about liver regeneration. But you have to be able to apply and incorporate what you know about basic cell biology, genetics, physiology, post-pathogen interactions to a situation that you've never seen before, and you actually have to look at research data and understand it. So then they're going to ask you a bunch of questions, and those questions, as Todd said, they're multiple choice questions, but they're very sophisticated. I mean, as a person who has a lot of difficulty writing decent multiple choice questions, these are really well written and highly sophisticated. A few of them are going to be straightforward. You'll be asked just to reiterate something that you read in the passage. What was the molecule? What was the control group? What did they do? But that's not most of the questions. Most of the questions are going to be in two categories. First, you're going to be asked to show that you really can interpret and understand what's in that passage by bringing in your background knowledge, not only from biology, but as Todd said, from math and physics and chemistry as well. So they might ask you what the function of the liver is in some sophisticated way, in terms of its function in glucose. In that particular example, one of the questions that they asked was, where do you think in the cell the serotonin receptors would be found? Well, it wasn't in the passage. They didn't tell you. You may not know anything about serotonin receptors, but you do know about cell signaling. You know generally about cell receptors. You know that sometimes, mostly they're on the cell membrane. Sometimes they're on the inside of the cell. So they're going to ask you to interpret what they told you in the passage and give your best estimate of where those receptors were. They showed a picture of serotonin. And then they asked, what kind of amino acid would have been the precursor from this, right? You've never seen that before. But all the information is there if you bring your background knowledge to bear. In other kinds of passages, they ask about enzyme kinetics, as Todd suggested, transport mechanisms. Right out of 207, what's the terminal electron acceptor in this electron transport chain that they were studying? None of that information is in the passage. You have to bring it from your background knowledge. The other thing that's really important, and this reiterates what Todd said, is interpretation of the data. So the way I like to think about this is that they want to be sure that you know how far can you go from the data presented in drawing conclusions. What are reasonable conclusions to draw? What are not reasonable conclusions to draw? From the graphs, from the figures, how to interpret them. You will definitely be asked about the statistical tests they use. They're not exotic. They're what you learn in a standard stat course, t-tests, analysis of variance. But you have to have enough of a mastery of those to know whether the researchers used an appropriate test. What other kind of tests might they have used, and what information might they have gotten out of that? So this is not a memorization test. This is a test about your ability to reason and think like a scientist. So you're going, oh my gosh, this is awful. I'm never going to be able to do this. But Todd's right. You can do this. And you can do it. You can do it by actually paying attention to your course. Oh, no. Maybe we should do that. But in a particular way. How many of you have actually looked at the practice questions on the AMC? Not many. It is never, ever too soon. If you think you are going to take the MCAT, start now. Be looking at, and I'm going to talk about the content material. That's all helpful. Actually look at those practice questions. You cannot understand this exam unless you actually get in there and have a panic experience like we all had. Oh my gosh, what are they asking? And realize that you can reason through it. So if you have that in the back of your mind and pay attention to certain kinds of things that I'm going to talk about in your coursework, then you'll be really well prepared. And then I'm going to suggest one other avenue to get ready for this exam. So, content. Yeah, we all know there's content. Content is what, that's the lifeline that students grab onto. Just give me the answer. That's all I want. Give me a flashcard. Let me memorize the definition. If you go to the AMC website, there are pages and pages and pages and pages of content. Print them out, as Bill Higgins says, post them on your wall, mark the ones you know, highlight the ones you don't know, study them, know them. You have to know them really well. No way around it. I'm going to reiterate what Todd said. The AAMC website and even many medical schools leave you with the impression that the biology portion is covered in Freshman Bio 102. Well, here, 106, 102 is Bio 2. Really, really helpful course because you are going to see evolutionary context on this exam. You might see an ecological context, but we really take issue with the idea that this is freshman level biology, or that you can take 2 bio courses with lab and be fine. This is high level sophisticated material. Even though the strict content is covered in 1 or 2 bio courses, you're not going to master that well enough with 105 and 106, or 105 in genetics, or 105 and 207. It's just not going to be enough. We work with Wendy. She had the list of the recommended courses. We try to keep that list manageable, so you don't have to be a biochem major to do this. But pay attention to that list. I get many, many students who say, well, 2 bio courses, that's enough. That's what they say. You're not going to make it with 2 bio courses. So I really believe, especially since almost everything in this test is in the context of some sort of life sciences application, the more biology you can take, really the better you'll be. And there's more content than content, right? This is a big picture exam. You have to look at what you're going to do with that content, develop the big picture, integrate concepts, and apply them. So let's talk about that. A lot more than facts. What does it mean to think like a scientist? One of the things that you'll be told is to be able to take what you've learned and really, what is our goal here? Our goal is to understand how life works. So whatever you're learning in whatever your class is, always ask yourself, what does this tell me about how an organism can actually accomplish things? Big picture, big picture. You're going to have to, let's jump to this, you're going to have to be able to move between different levels. Understand a big concept, see it in a specific example. You're going to have to be flexible in the way you understand biological science and the way life works. And you have to make linkages. So all of these pictures are images of different aspects of metabolism in some way. So you could have a flashcard and memorize metabolism, you could memorize these pathways, and you don't understand metabolism. What you should be able to do is take all these images and put them into a concept map and explain the relationships between them, how they relate to each other, big picture, energy transformations, really detailed picture, ionic gradients, and how they're involved in generating energy, usable energy sources. So this is the way you've got to be thinking. You've got to get out of your silos and be making linkages and connections all the time. This just reiterates that. This is some different ways that you would understand neuronal function, membrane potential across the axon during an action potential, ionic flow during an action potential, what's happening in a synapse. But then this image is representing diabetic neuropathy, right? So all of this basic stuff has to be brought to bear to understand the function of a whole organism. Okay, now, you can't stop at the door of your biology courses. You must integrate. you don't fool us. We know. We read course evaluations. We actually read them. And we know that when you walk into chemistry and they're teaching your biology, you're going, what? I want to learn chemistry in this class. Don't tell me about biology. We know you say that about physics. But the physicist should actually mention biology. I'll tell you, that just does not work. Look at this nice little phrase. I love this. Medicine is the application of biological science to individual patients. But biology emerges from chemistry. We know that. Biology doesn't happen except for how chemistry happens. But of course, chemistry emerges from physics, and the physicist will tell you physics is math. So you've got to integrate across all of those and take those blinders off. Carry your physics and math and chemistry into your biology courses, carry your biology into the other courses. We try to force feed you this stuff. But you have to be active about it. You have to be active about making these connections. Some of your faculty are, like Patty and Todd, go out of their way to make sure that you do this. Not all of your faculty are going to. They're going to walk in, they're going to lecture, they're going to walk out. You have to take an active part in it. Otherwise, you're not going to be prepared when you get to this test. But you can do it. All right. Applications. It's all about applications. Things you've never seen before. Yes, we read course evaluations. I know. You walk into exam and the faculty member asks you something that he or she has never mentioned in class. Oh, this is so unfair. How can they do this? This is really awful. Hands on the table and complain. I know you do. You need to embrace that. You need to embrace that. That is exactly what you want to happen. Whether you get the question right or wrong, you have to think, what are the fundamental principles that I learned in this class that the instructor is asking me to apply to this new situation? And if you do that and get rid of your emotional reactivity to it, then you'll be very prepared, whether you're going to medical school or graduate school or going into whatever situation in life. If you take this approach of applying what you know to new situations, you're going to be so much better off. So you can do this. So our point of view is if you are active in your studying and you listen to the expectations of your faculty, and you listen to the expectations of AAFC, Todd's right. Students from the University of Maryland are going to do really well on this exam. There's one last thing I want to mention. One last thing that you might not have thought about. This test has a lot of reading scientific literature, brand new things you've never seen before. I suggest you get every opportunity to do that. You can do it on your own. You may be thinking, I'd like to be an orthopedic surgeon. So latch on in your mind to ACL reconstructions. That's not just about the surgery. There's a whole basic research literature on the physics, the biology, the chemistry of the ligaments, the structures, the extracellular matrix, everything associated with the ACL. You could do that. You could make that your specialty and go out and read everything you can about it. And that will help you on this test. You can get experience in a research lab. That's fine, nothing wrong with that. But you don't have to do that to become good at reading and speaking the literature. Seek out courses. Talk to your friends. Which courses are actually asking you to read the research literature? Many of them do, some more than others. But even starting in 105, you're asked to read the literature. Now, here's one you might not have thought about. Every department in CMNS is a research department. Whether you're one of our majors or not, you are perfectly welcome to go to research seminars. They bring in faculty from off campus, from on campus. They talk about cutting edge research. You are perfectly welcome to go, and you're going to learn some very interesting things. So the schedules are posted, so you could go to the entomology department and listen to a presentation on reproductive polyphenism in aphids, and you're going, why should I do that? You're going to do that because this is a really good opportunity to see how much of a cutting-edge research presentation can you grasp. How much can you weed through the words you don't understand and apply the biology you know? So that's a really good opportunity. The other thing that you will see here, you will see active researchers, faculty, postdocs, graduate students. critiquing the presenter. I mean, this is what graduate school is all about. You know, you learn to rip apart each other's presentation work. That's what you do, right? Because that's what critical thinking is all about. Well, yeah. Yes. But it is the best training in critical thinking. And you will see people challenging, asking for interpretations, asking for reasoning. So it's a good place to see roll-ons for how this critical thinking kind of work goes. So that's what I'm telling you about the biology portion. We think you're going to be very successful at this exam. And don't panic, but start early getting ready. Good? All right.
I don't feel as peppy as.
I tell you, you're whoa. I guess I'm not an afternoon person. I don't think I'm a morning person either. I don't know what that leaves me with.
No, I've seen you teach. You are incredible.
Okay.
When it comes to working.
I also, this will become very clear when we hit my slides, that I am also not a slide generator. We do a lot of chalk talking in chemistry, so that could be a little bit of trouble. Okay, so here are an overview of what I would say are the chemistry and biochemistry sort of talking points when we're looking at the new Mcat, okay? Interestingly, there's far less organic. Certainly, there's very little organic 1 on the new Mcat. About the only thing that's coming through is stereochemistry, which really is relevant when you're in Orgo 2 and when you're in biochemistry as well. So that's just a skill set that you start seeing in Orgo 1. But past that, most of the organic are what we would consider second semester topics, really carbonyl chemistry. And really where they like to focus a lot of that attention is metabolism. You look at metabolism, whether it's glycolysis, gluconeogenesis, right? or any of that, you actually can look at the organic chemistry behind that and see those mechanisms in action, see that Orgo 2 material in action. So it's a lot of application of Orgo 2, right, into those biochemical pathways is what I would say. There are definitely standalone questions that would be Orgo 2 related. Now, what's interesting about that is I would guess that would be the one place that Maryland students would see that as an Orgo 1 subject, because they do carry spectroscopy through. There's a lot of spectroscopy. There was at least a few on every exam. They asked very esoteric questions about IR spectroscopy and some structural questions from NMR. Typically that's taught in Orgo 2. But here at Maryland, as you know, it's taught in Orgo 1. So certainly, I think their approach is to really offer a lot more Orgo 2 than they're offering from Orgo 1 in terms of the material. So while we've been marginalized in organic chemistry, certainly we're down to really the Orgo 2 topics that are left behind. Biochemistry is certainly new. I will have more to say about that, but I would say for the most part, there is a huge emphasis on protein structure and function. I mean, every question that I saw that's related to biochemistry comes back to protein structure and function, for sure. So that is your 461 class. 461 is all about protein structure and function. 462 covers metabolism in a full semester, and 463, which is the other potential biochemistry course, offers protein structure and function and some metabolism, okay? So it's sort of bifurcated. So it depends on how much exposure you need to the material and how well you learn on the fly. Biochem 463 is a very challenging syllabus, extremely challenging syllabus. I liken it to Orgo 1, where we cover in Orgo 1 14 chapters in one semester, which I always thought, just so we know, a little bit unfair, right? Because the Orgo 2 folks only have to cover like 7, right? And we cover 14, and we get nailed in our evaluation. But Biochem 463 is the same. We cover a ton of chapters in that Biochem 463 syllabus because we're racing through protein structure, function, metabolism, membranes, etc. So you really have to make a choice as to how well you learn the material. Do you learn really well to get it all in and see it all and be prepared and know how to figure out how to get the information into your brain when the MCAT is approaching, or are you someone who likes to extend that knowledge out over 2 semesters and sort of see it in action more, for sure. So I think you need to think about that.
General chemistry, there's definitely a lot of general chemistry there, and honestly, I know physics is supposed to be on that exam, and I would say 1 or 2 passages were truly physics, that I'd have to be a physics, I would have had to take physics relatively recently to do well. But a lot of the passages in that physical science section, I can get to from the chemistry side as well. I did not have to come at that from one avenue. I can certainly have taken it from my chemistry frame into those problems and do equally as well. So, but if you want to think about basic chemistry, stoichiometry is a big thing. You have to be able to do your dimensional analysis. There are a bunch of questions on stoichiometry. I was actually really quite surprised because that's a general chemistry 1 topic, right? And that's something that's talked about a lot in high school. You do a lot of stoichiometry. I was quite shocked, but there was 4 or 5 questions easily on stoichiometry alone. So something to think about. Make sure you're able to do your dimensional analysis. Tons of formula-based calculations without giving you formulas. So you need to know when you read the passage what type of formula you need to use, apply, right, to get at the answer. There are formulas that range from thermochemistry, right, understanding Q equals MC delta T, that's the heat of a reaction, to energy, equals H nu. So really, you need to know those formulas and when to apply them, what units to apply with them. That was big. I mean, I know them, but I know that's one of the limiting features when people come into our chemistry exams. Which, by the way, what's wrong with being a biochemistry major? There's nothing wrong with that, Joe. Yeah, but not everybody. But not everybody has to. So I would definitely say, though, that all the chemistry that's seen was given truthfully with a biological framework. On the old Mcat, there was a lot of questions that were outside of systems biology, and now all of those questions have come to inside that framework. So I think that's very important to recognize, as everyone's been telling you, that really they're asking you to integrate a lot of these subjects together. Hopefully we're doing an okay job of that. Everyone else here seems very enthusiastic about it, so I'll just go with that. Questions that are centered on analysis are things like enzyme kinetics and inhibition models. You best know every single one of those. You better know a Km, you better know a Kcat. You better know how to get them off of graphs, not just if they're given to you, not just know what a Km is, what is a Kcat. You need to be able to look at a graph and know the slope is equal to this and the y-intercept. You have to interpret that, not given anywhere in written form in the passage.
So it kills minutes and minutes down.
Down. Hard line. You need to know your inhibition models. You need to know your substrate models, right? You need to know your enzyme kinetics, hands down, okay? Right from how to generate the graphs up through how to analyze the data and what it means. So, huge emphasis. There are many structure-based considerations. Do not come into the Mcat without being able to write out 20 amino acids. You need to be able to write out the structure for 20 amino acids and know which ones are nonpolar, know which ones are aromatic, know which ones are acidic, know which ones are basic, know the pKa's of the side chains like glutamate, aspartate, lysine, and arginine. You think I'm kidding? I'm totally not kidding. If I didn't have that right in my hot little head, I would not have been able to answer 6, 7, 8, 9 of the questions as from past papers. So that's pretty crazy. Knowing all those amino acids and knowing what they mean in terms of structure and function is really important. That is something we cover in 461. It is covered in 463 to a lesser degree. 461 has a really hard line piece on that. pH, pKa, that's Chem 271, right? Everyone hates 271 and 272, I know. And you hate it even more when we're still talking about it in biochemistry. But there's a bunch of buffer problems. I'm telling you, you best know how to do those calculations. They ask lots of questions that require the use of Henderson-Hasselbalch, not just to give an actual number, but to actually interpret the meaning behind it. That's scary, I recognize. Separation methodologies. That means, if I use an ion exchange resin, or if I use a gel filtration column, what's going to happen? Where are my proteins going to come out if I put them on these columns? If I take fractions from these columns and I put them on an SDS page gel, where am I going to find them on this SDS page gel? recognizing, right, that gel filtration and SDS-PAGE run opposite to one another. Very interesting, but they're testing your ability to see that and know that and generate that information. So there's a lot of stuff on separation methodologies. Really, the OChem is centered on mechanistic principles. So if you have a good sense of the general types of reactions you studied in Orgo 2, right? Nucleophilic addition, nucleophilic substitution, that should be something that rings a bell. Nucleophilic addition, nucleophilic substitution, they're different, right? Then you're probably okay. You're going to see a lot of these types of mechanistic questions, though, on the MCAT. And then basic stats. There's stats related to the chemistry that they're trying to show, and they're doing this all over the test. So, but basic stats was something I thought to be very useful as I sat there on Friday taking the MCAT. So things that you need to recall, and I've said some of this already. So the last slide was really about things that are skills, right? That you need to acquire, that you need to hone. But there are things that are still what I would say a recall. You cannot read unless you know your alphabet, unless you have some phonetic sounds. And it's going to be pretty hard to come into the MCAT without knowing some things. You need to know your stereochemistry? Absolutely. Okay? You need to know spectroscopy. I would know, and they're not going to give you a chart, which is all what you want us to give you on the organic exams, is a chart, right? I don't do that. You all know that. But which is why some of you have never seen me a day in your life until I'm standing up here, right? And some of you are like, I've seen you enough. You need to know about intermolecular attractions. That seems like such a basic concept, but it is played out so much on that MCAT. If you think about how and why some molecule is going to bind within a substrate binding pocket, it binds, right, by these intermolecular attractions. You've got to be able to look at a molecule hands down and say, this is the hydrophobic region, van der Waals forces. This is going to be electrostatic. This is going to be hydrogen bonding. I'm going to choose this molecule to be a substitute for this one because it's got the same sort of location and type. If a reaction was oxidation, reduction, what the oxidizing agent was, what the reducing agent was, how many electrons passed. That was a good one. I was like, oh geez. I mean, I know, but I was very, very shocked. And I'm not sure we spent a good amount of time on redox chemistry to the point that you're seeing the interdisciplinary nature. And that's something we can certainly talk about, but you have to know that hands down. Now, I wouldn't know, and maybe you know from biology, right off the bat, if something that is biologically relevant would be a reducing agent or an oxidizing agent. But I know from the half reactions.
Most likely, some teachers will do reducing and oxidizing agents, and they do that in the major section. That's one thing we've taken out of the non-major section, mainly because that's something that sort of explodes in their head.
I understand it explodes in our head. I'm telling you it's going to explode on your test. Unless you start getting this math. 4.
Yeah,
I'm in shock.
we do it, and sometimes explain about we do explain about electrons and what passes through all the other things you mentioned.
Right.
We don't mention oxidizing reducing agent.
Yeah. So we definitely need to know that terminology coming in because you don't want that to throw you, right? I mean, those are questions you can get right. This is my point. You can get those right if you know the terminology, hands down, okay? Amino acids with pKa, which may be not good. So, maybe be more thoughtful with your dimensional analysis so that you wouldn't be thrown by any question on the test. But you guys all know that you can sort of plod through those if you know what you're trying to get to. These last 3 skills, honing them is going to come from those biochemistry courseworks, probably, I'm guessing, from the cell bio lab, right? Yeah, we do some of that. But one smart thing that I found and that I use in my biochemistry class is a book and it's an older book, I know, but it's called Cases in Biochemistry. And it's by Kathleen Cornely. I can't remember if Cornely is spelled with 1 L or 2 L's. I'm going to go with 2, but I could be wrong. It could be 1. She's out of Providence College, PC. And she's got a great little book that does what I would say are MCAT-like passages. she actually takes research articles, abstracts out the story, and does a Reader's Digest version, I liked that, a Reader's Digest version of the story, and then has a couple of figures from these papers and asks questions. She asks global questions, how does this fit into the bigger picture, and then she asks questions about the actual data that she's pulled from the paper. Those are great places to go to get practice looking at actual data and passages on things you've never seen before, right? And allow yourself to practice this. So I would suggest this book as you're coming into these last three. I think this book does a very good job at each of these types of skills, making sure that you can hone them, okay? All right, so these are the topics that get a lot of playtime. So if I were to say, these are the heavy hitters, these are the ones that you are gonna say, I'm gonna get most bang for my buck by studying these things. We already said amino acids, you come in, you know all of them. Redox concepts, it's more abundant than I thought. Enzyme kinetics, modes of inhibition, a bunch of questions, at least 2 passages related to that, which is a good, 12 questions. Intermolecular attractions, stoichiometry, and what I would call the classic biochemistry models. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean things like, if we talk about structural proteins, we talk about fibrous proteins a lot. There's a lot, so playtime on collagen and keratin, what I would say fibrous proteins. There's I think there was at least 1, if not 2 passages on hemoglobin, myoglobin. That's on a lot of your stuff, but understand that. They're doing things like what you've probably seen on your exam, fetal myoglobin, right, versus the mother's hemoglobin versus the mother's hemoglobin, what that means in terms of oxygen transport. But they're doing it a little differently. They're saying, oh, we found this crazy species, right, that changes this out. What's going to be the effect? And they're looking to see that you can make some inferences behind that. So this is what I mean about the classic biochemistry models. And those are some classic ones that we talk about in the courses as we talk about protein structure and function. Okay? I really do think that's it. Yes? Very good. Sure. Actually, no Todd Baylor, oil rig is the other one I use. Isn't that crazy? I pose this question to my class all the time.
So the difference. Okay, so the chemistry and physics, I can't even say I play a physicist on TV, so I'm saying that. But I'm a biologist and I've been involved arguing with the physicists for a long time about the nature of what ought to be taught in physics 131, 132, where this comes from. So, and I look at it from the perspective of a biologist trying to answer the physics question, so maybe I can give you insights that are actually more useful than the physicists to whom all this stuff is crushingly obvious. Okay, so physical and chemical foundation sections is 25% physics. Traditionally physics, if you go to a conventional physics class, there'll be a few fundamental equations that will appear in multiple different circumstances. And the whole course in physics, from my perspective, is being able to decode the different circumstances to see the fundamental equations that appear, whether it's a spring or a planet or an inclined plane or a whole wide variety of other sorts of circumstances. Right? It's basically understanding the foundations of physics. And the original MCAT that I looked at was asking similar types of questions. On this MCAT, it's completely different. Right? They have identified particular areas that they want you to know. These areas don't necessarily relate to these few fundamental Newtonian mechanical questions or formulas, but actually have their own sorts of formulas associated with that. So they focus on energy, motion, fluids, diffusion, electricity, light and sound waves, and atomic structure as they are relevant to biological and chemical processes. And Bonnie's right. Sometimes you can actually answer these questions by coming at them from the chemistry, and especially chemistry from 271. You can also come from the biology. Right? And so if you've actually been paying attention in the chemistry courses when they've been talking about atomic structure, in the biology courses when we've been talking about circulation and fluid flow and gas exchange and a variety of other phenomena and talk about the physics, that physics will again come to play. Right? The real advantage is that 131, 132 physics are the country's models for the courses that are preparing for them. So the equations that you're learning, and there's a lot fewer equations in 131 and 132 than is the traditional physics class, those equations are the equations you're expected to know. So if you pay attention in 131, 132, you basically have your notes for reviewing for the physics section. And those are the equations that you need to know. Okay? The pre-meds who are taking engineering physics, right? You have to combine your straight physics with the relevant physics that you learned in your biology and chemistry classes. Right? Because essentially the engineering physics is like the traditional physics described up there. It's a few fundamental equations appearing in multiple different circumstances. Newtonian mechanics appearing again and again and again. This is really very different. And I'll go through an example to show you the physics I expect you to know is really very different. Okay, so we already talked about this, but 3/4 of the multiple choice questions are based on scientific practices, extended abstracts, Reader's Digest versions. Each passage is going to contain, and Joelle talked about, basic information system, technical methods, and/or several types of data presentation, figures, tables, pictures, or models. And then the test will proceed to ask a whole wide range of different questions about that. Every time I read a passage, I said, John, there are all these great questions they could ask, and none of the questions that I thought about could be asked in the passages. Right? So while you're reviewing, looking at that exam, one of the ways you can study for that exam is to read the passage that's in the practice exam, and then think about all the different types of questions that could be asked based on that, and make sure you're comfortable with that. Right? Because you're going to get an incredible range of different questions. And from my experience, every time I thought that this would be the logical questions to ask, they never were the questions to ask. So once again, I sort of failed as a professional in this. Okay. So I'm going to say approach these passages different than the verbal reasoning, and this is a skill you've got to do. So imagine on your screen, on the left side is the passage, and on the right side is one or perhaps two questions. And after you answer the first two questions, the passage stays there, right? And then the next questions come up, so the passage is always there. Each one of these passages has much more information than you're going to need to answer. There's all kinds of distractors, right? There may be curves with 3 or 4 lines on them, right? Do not spend a huge amount of time reading that passage. Right? Read it quickly, understand where the information is, and then start looking at the questions. See what the questions are, and then go back and fish out the information you know. If you spend all your time focusing on reading and understanding each one of the figures before you answer the questions, you're going to waste a lot of time. Right? So develop the ability to read pretty quickly and then reference back, because that passage is still on the screen. Okay? So practice how to do that. That's an essential skill, and that's something that I've never seen before on the multiple choices. This is a skill you've got to master. You've got to practice. You've got to be able to read that extended abstract, that Reader's Digest version, quickly to know where the information is, and then read the questions and go back to get the specific information you need to answer. So I'm going to basically go through one of these passage questions and show you exactly what is sort of expected. Right? So this is taken from an American Association of Physics Teachers papers. There's a brief text description. Central nervous system as an electrical system operating within humans. Various classes of neurons and different structures of neurons. So there's sensory motor neurons. They're talking about dendrites and axons. Various molecules in the extracellular fluids. Round up the usual suspects. Sodium, potassium, and chloride. Right? And then they give you a chart that says electrical properties of axons. They're not going to define what the terms are, but they're going to give you the values. They go non-myelinated and myelinated axons. They're not telling you what that is, but they're going to expect you to interpret that. Right? They'll give you a simple model, electrical circuit model of the membrane, right, where the resistances across the membrane presumably coincide with the nodes of NBA. They don't tell you that, but they give you the model. Because they want you thinking about the system as an electrical system. Right? And then they give you essentially a action potential to show the membrane potential changes associated with the action potential. Okay, that's what they've given you. Huge amounts of data. Right? Huge amounts of ideas. Now here are the questions that they're going to ask. I can't copy the questions because they're copyrighted, but question 1 asks about the direction of electrical field across that membrane. Right? The only things you need to know about that is you need to know that inside the membrane is negative relative to outside the membrane, and the physics convention that current flows from the positive terminal to the negative terminal. Right? And essentially so there's just a bunch of charts showing fields, and the correct answer really has the field lines going from the extracellular fluid across the membrane. Do you understand, essentially in this case, that this is an electrical system? All the questions asked you about. Right? The next question, what's the role of the myelinated sheet? Right? They're asking you to go back and look at that table, right? And look at the table, right? Of showing all these electrical properties. And what's the role? So the role is you look for the difference between the myelinated sheet and the non-myelinated sheet, right? It has to do with conductivity. Right? The myelinated sheet is much more insulated. Right? Really simple. Do you know what these terms mean, and can you put it into a biological circumstance? The answer to the question is that the myelinated sheet insulates the axon. Number 3, okay? They give you a bunch of ions and ask which is, you have this hypothetical channel. As you know, these channels are involved essentially in electrical transmission, right? They ask which channel conveys the smallest ion. Right? There's a periodic table, right? And all you got to do is look at the periodic table and realize that sodium is smaller than potassium, which is smaller than chloride. So the answer is sodium. Right? The periodic table is given to you. Right? Simply, you don't have to remember. You can memorize the atomic weights of sodium and potassium and chlorine. You just look at the table. Again, but they want you to be able to think about what these channels are doing. So it's asking you a question about the channels and the properties of channels. Okay. Number 4, they're going to ask you what's the shortest distance between electrodes for measuring voltage. They're asking you a technical question. Right? And they want you to be able to look at essentially the action potential, right? And realize, well, how far do these have to be apart for me to be able to see the propagation of that action potential? Right? Turns out to be a very simple question. They're simply asking you probably the first equation you learned in physics, which is delta x equals v times t. The distance is equal to the velocity times the time. Really, really simple question, and you can pick off the answer. You can also do a dimensional analysis, because you know that the answer has to be a distance. You can pick off the answer by simply looking at the 1 millisecond, being able to read the graph and say it's 1 millisecond between the time it takes for the action potential to be fully realized, and it moves at 100 meters per second. Right? Really basic kinds of information they're asking. But they're asking you to be able to interpret it and reason with it. Last one. They ask you to calculate the current in an action potential. They're not even telling you to do the calculation. What do you need to be able to do that? And they give you a bunch of different terms, right? Well, to calculate the current, you have to calculate the voltage times the resistance, but they don't give you the word resistance. They give you receptivity, which is essentially the resistance divided by the distance. So you need a measure of length. Again, Ohm's law. How more basic can you be? Right? Again, they're simply saying what are the basic, use what you know, interpret these basic truths. So I expected all kinds of fancy sorts of questions from them. I expected that you'd have to memorize the action of different membrane proteins. Those of you who take 207 know that I can talk about that forever, right? And if you don't know it, I can kill you on the final exam. There's blood on the floor, right? But they can ask you that, but they don't, right? They can ask you, the equations for electrical fields, Coulomb's laws, Gauss's laws. They could ask you for electrical circuits. Kirchhoff's law rules? No, I'm not asking you to do that. They're asking you to basically interpret the essentially information provided in the text of tables and figures and apply basic knowledge of fundamental concepts to answer the equation. I'm not going to say you don't need that information because there may be standalone questions that will require you to know something about Gauss's law, or may require you to know something about the sodium voltage-gated channel. But in general, these questions are essentially going to ask you to do very basic concepts to interpret the figures and the information that they give you. Okay? I think that's it. Oh, Dr. Siegel.
So I just wandered in here, and I just want to say I'm so excited to see so many people willing to enlist in the nation's armed forces. Look at the sucker scar, it will be all good. I have to give you a small disclaimer. Nothing that I say today necessarily reflects the views of the U.S. government, the U.S. Army, or anyone else besides myself. My name is Aaron Siegel, and I'm the Associate Dean for Recruitment Admissions at Uniformed Services University. I already knew that you had an incredibly passionate